the awakening of the eternal capacity to experience. In the beginning, there was nothing at all, or at least nothing in particular. Until language developed, there was not much to say about anything because there were not any labels to distinguish anything in particular from anything else. But even then, there was something eternal, something that was present before language developed. That something can be labeled in many ways, such as the awakened one. The awakened one noticed the developing of language. Here's how language developed. First, there was just the awakened one, and next, the awakened one noticed various contrasting qualities of experience, such as loud and quiet, bright and dark, warm and cool, wet and dry, and so on. Those contrasting experiences were given labels, which was the developing of language. Language did not just develop by itself, though. There was already something through which it developed, something that developed it. There was already the experience of contrast, right, which preceded the labeling of those contrasting experiences. The experiencing of contrast could be another label in language for the awakened one. The experiencing of contrast could be another label in language for the awakened one. The awakened one could be another label in language for the experiencing of contrast. First, there's the capacity to experience contrast. Or just, we could say, the capacity to experience. All experience involves contrast, right? So first there's the experience of contrast, first there's the capacity to experience contrast and the experiencing of contrast, and then comes the labeling of various experiences of contrast. Hot, cold, sound, silent. Finally, there is an experience of a very subtle contrast between the capacity to experience contrast, capacity, and the various contrasts experienced externally. That capacity is itself neither loud or quiet, fast or slow, bright or dark, warm or cool, wet or dry. That capacity for experience is recognized in contrast with all of its experiences. And all those contrasting labels. But there can then be, once it's noticed that there's this capacity for experience, that can also be labeled in language, such as calling it the awakened one or the capacity to experience, and so on. That inherent, eternal capacity, in contrast to these changing experiences, temporary experiences, that inherent, eternal capacity can be labeled in the language of contrast as the awakened one, right? The loud and quiet aren't the awakened one. Fast and slow aren't the awakened one. Language is not the awakened one. The eternal, inherent capacity to experience can be labeled in the language of contrast as the awakened ones. Experiences of loud and quiet are not the awakened capacity to experience. The awakened capacity to experience is not the contrasting experiences of bright or dark, warm or cool, wet or dry. The capacity to experience is the awakened one, or at least could be. We'll come back to that. What would it mean for the capacity to be an awakened capacity? Because there is really, or an awake capacity, because there really is the capacity to experience, and then calling it awake or labeling it when it recognizes itself and labels itself, that is a distinct thing from its fundamental, inherent eternity. So, the capacity to experience is eternal and impersonal. There's no limited personality or limited persona associated with it fundamentally. The capacity to experience is eternal and impersonal and absolute and unchanging. It's never not present. It's eternal in its capacity. The contrasting experiences themselves, like hot and cold and loud and quiet and fast and slow, they're temporary, they're limited. Language itself arises and then disappears and is not present, then comes back. Language is contrasting or relative. It's full of labels. It is labels. It's not wrong for being full of labels or having contrast. It's just language. That's what it is. So when we notice what language is, then we can also notice the capacity to use language, the capacity to experience, as distinct from particular usages of language and language itself. There's, so to speak, the one who can use language. So one of the things that can happen with language is that the eternal capacity to experience can be labeled as not eternal, as temporary and limited, even if it is not. In other words, a false label can be used, an inaccurate label, a label in contrast to the reality. Similarly, with language, a label that contains the word pickles, like a physical label that says pickles, can be stuck on a jar that actually does not have any pickles in it, such as an empty jar or a jar full of peanut butter, but it has a label that says pickles. So changing the label on a jar does not actually change the content of the jar. An empty jar is still empty, a jar full of peanut butter is still a jar full of peanut butter, but now it has a label that says pickles, and that's just a label that says pickles. Similarly, changing the language used to reference the eternal capacity for experience does not actually change the eternal capacity for experience. It can't be fundamentally and inherently limited. It can't be temporary. It can simply be labeled. It can pretend to be what it's been labeled, or what it labels itself. So the eternal capacity for experience can be labeled in language as only a temporary jar of pickles, limited to a particular range of experiences, just these, the good ones, with nothing else possible except for whatever the externally applied labels on the outside of the jar identify as a possible experience for the temporary jar of pickles, or the so-called temporary jar of pickles, which definitely cannot be the eternal capacity to experience. It can't become that, it can't be that, because no one has ever applied that label to it, so that simply must be impossible. That's the kind of stuff that can happen in language. We could call that pretending. Pretending that impossibility is real. That's kind of a funny thing to say, right? Pretending that impossibility is real. Okay. Does the label actually define the thing? Does the language actually define the thing? Does the language, temporary jar of pickles, make something into a temporary jar of pickles? Does it make the eternal capacity to experience into a temporary jar of pickles? If you put a police officer's uniform on a monkey, does that make the monkey into a Forest? So language is the realm of the impossible, the realm of the absurd, we might say. The realm of the impossible. Nothing is impossible except in language. Look around and identify one tangible thing, one tangible event, one tangible phenomenon that is impossible. Can you find anything out there, any real thing, any tangible thing that's impossible? Only in language does the conceptual category of possible, in contrast to impossible, arise. Only in language does impossible, in contrast to possible, arise. So the eternal capacity to experience can label itself something else, such as a temporary jar of pickles, or as an impossible possibility, or as a jumbo shrimp, or as a shrimpless shrimp, or a selfless self, whatever. The eternal capacity to experience can even label the specific possibility of an eternal capacity to experience as fundamentally impossible, or at least impossible in regard to a temporary jar of pickles ever becoming the eternal capacity to experience, such as through some methods or affiliations, membership in a particular church, or attendance at a particular retreat, some rituals, some initiations, some achievements, some practices, some new labels, some new circumstances. However, what if the thing labeled only a temporary jar of pickles is not the label that it has used for itself? What if the eternal capacity to experience has actually just been pretending that it is only a temporary jar of pickles? It's not really a temporary jar of pickles. It's just been pretending. It's been using that label and pretending that it is the label that it's been using. Hey, I'm a temporary jar of pickles. I'm a forest. I'm a monkey dressed as a police officer with a label on my police uniform that says Forest, because that's my last name. Forrest Gump. Whatever. Okay, so pretending. Playful, potentially, right? Playful pretending. Pretending. Playing. Language. Impossible. Language is the realm of pretending. An actual temporary jar of pickles cannot pretend to be something else. This is a jar of pickles. An actual physical label that says eternal capacity to experience that has been placed on an actual temporary jar of pickles cannot pretend to be something other than a label. It's just, labels don't pretend, jars of pickles don't pretend, but the eternal capacity to experience can pretend. And only the eternal capacity to experience can pretend. And only through language. First, there's the eternal capacity of experience, then it develops or creates language, then it pretends with language, then it labels itself as a limited creation of language, and pretends to forget that it is not a particular label, but is actually the source of the labeling. It pretends that it's just a particular label. It may even say, I am not the eternal capacity to experience. In fact, there is no such thing. It may even say that language is not the realm of labeling, or pretending, or impossibility, but the realm of truth. That's pretending, though. It may even say that language is the realm of truth. Language which was created by the capacity to experience, the eternal capacity to experience, can be labeled as inherently true. What do we say that language is? What do we pretend that language is? Do we say it's inherently true? It's the realm of truth? Do we label the eternal capacity to experience as inherently unreliable? It can be labeled, so many different ways, and it's subject to alteration by what labels are used, and it's inherently, it's not just unreliable, it's impossible. It's inherently just a temporary jar of pickles, and so on. The eternal capacity to experience is not the eternal capacity to experience. That is a construction in language. It's absurd. It's silly. It's pretensive. It's playful, whatever. The eternal capacity to experience is. and it can use labels. It can pretend. If the eternal capacity to experience ever notices that language is actually fundamentally just language, while the eternal capacity to experience is not fundamentally linguistic, but itself is the very foundation or root from which arises the language of contrast, then something may happen that may be called an awakening. The eternal capacity to experience may stop labeling itself as other than the eternal capacity to experience, or at least stop pretending that linguistic labels are not just linguistic labels, but are the absolute truth. The eternal capacity to experience can stop pretending that language is the absolute truth. The eternal capacity to experience is the only absolute truth. Language is not required for the absolute truth to be absolute, or else that truth would not be absolute, as in beyond mere labels of pretense. Language is the realm of pretense. The eternal capacity to experience is the realm of the absolute, the realm of the absolute truth, the foundation of language, the foundation of pretense, but it's not itself language or pretense. The awakened one is not the temporary jar of pickles. The temporary jar of pickles does not awaken, and the label on the jar does not awaken. The eternal capacity to experience that notices itself as the eternal capacity to experience, or even simply stops labeling itself otherwise, that's what we might call the awakened one, the awakened eternal capacity to experience. The awakening of the eternal capacity to experience is simply the recognizing of labels as labels, labeling as labeling, language as language. The eternal capacity to experience was never really a temporary jar of pickles. It was just pretending. When the eternal capacity to experience notices directly what language and linguistic labels are, that development can be labeled the awakening of the awakened one, or the awake one. However, such a labeling in language may be of no particular importance. After all, it is just language, just a label. When the eternal capacity to experience recognizes itself as the eternal capacity to experience, and also recognizes what language is and what pretending in language is, it may or may not be especially interested in language and labels. It may continue various patterns of pretending or not. It may continue to use language or not. You are not a temporary formation in language. You are not what you and others may have been pretending that you are. You are not what others have labeled you, or what you have labeled yourself. Those were just labels, and that was all just pretending. You are distinct from the linguistic labels and the pretending. You are earlier than all of those linguistic labels and all of that pretending. Before those labels were applied to you, you were already here. It's like before a person graduates from college and is declared a graduate, they've been in college and they were there. Before a baby is named, there's a baby already. I could name my car or my boat, and like we paint something on the side of the boat. I go, okay, now the boat is named whatever. And we, crack a jar against the side of the boat and, have this little ritual of naming the boat. Well, the boat was already there before the paint was applied to the boat. The boat was there. And before the ritual was done to name it, it was there. It's just like recognizing the boat that was already there. Naming something, labeling something, using language to reference something, recognizes what's already there. The capacity to create, the capacity to use language, the capacity to experience, those are already here. You are distinct from the linguistic labels and the pretending. You are earlier than all of those linguistic labels and all of that pretending. Before those labels were applied to you, you were already here. Before someone pretended anything, someone was here. Who? What? You are the eternal capacity to experience. You may have been pretending otherwise. That's fine. You may have been pretending any number of things. That's the kind of stuff the eternal capacity experience might do. The eternal capacity to pretend. Okay. You are the absolute truth beyond language and labels and pretending. You are the awakened one. You are the awake one. Have fun.